Giannis and his agent have started conversations with the Milwaukee Bucks about his future, discussing whether his best fit is staying or going elsewhere. That isn't actually a trade request, but it's pretty close, and it makes it seem like Giannis being traded away from the Milwaukee Bucks is pretty imminent. So now we've got to talk about all of the different trade possibilities. Now, it's funny that this is even being brought up because I recently made a video talking about how it would be difficult to trade for Giannis in the middle of the season for two reasons. One, salary-wise, it's a little bit harder to make everything work now rather than in the offseason. And same thing with kind of integrating him into your team, because a lot of these teams are competing. You're trading away a lot of stuff in the middle of the year to integrate Giannis to your team. But if Giannis requests a trade, the Bucks have to entertain that possibility. And here's the handful of teams I think they would go to. I think the first phone call that they make is to the Houston Rockets. They have a bunch of stuff to offer. They have all kinds of young guys, all kinds of picks. And in terms of foundational players the Bucks would like to get back in exchange for Giannis, I think Houston is your first call. Now, this trade I have on screen here is not what the actual trade would be, but it gives you an indication of what kind of players, just from a salary perspective, would have to be involved in this deal in order to make it work for Houston. The Van Vliet contract would have to be in there. Then you've got Jabari, you've got Reed Shepherd, you've got Tari Eason. Obviously, there's other pieces here, but my assumption is Houston is not trading Alperen Şengün in this deal. They're not trading Amen Thompson in this deal, and they're not trading Steven Adams, not because the Bucks would want Steven Adams, but because the Rockets value him. And the only reason I mention him is because he does make about $12 million, which would make the salary matching a little bit easier. But if you take away all of those pieces, this is kind of where you would have to be at salary-wise. And I know it seems crazy because it's Giannis, but the Rockets are really good, and I really don't think that they're going to entertain trading Şengün or Amen Thompson this deal, and they are probably the toughest negotiators in the entire league, and they're just going to tell the Bucks from the jump, we're not including either of those guys. And so that might elongate the conversations, but I definitely think Houston is the first stop. They could do this package plus, if you want to throw another young player in there, you can. If you want to throw a bunch of picks in there, obviously that would be part of this as well. And if it's this structure, obviously the Rockets are looking at a situation where they traded away Reed Shepherd and they have like no guards left on the team. But you know what they do have? Amen Thompson, Kevin Durant, Giannis, and Alperen Şengün. Like, that's an unbelievable team. And even though Oklahoma City looks really, really good, that would be about as close as you could get to Oklahoma City, at least in the middle of the year. So pros and cons here, right? If you're Milwaukee, I think that Houston is as much value as you are going to be able to get out of this in terms of future picks and in terms of compensation. Obviously, that's important. The negatives for them would just be they don't have any of their own picks, really, or at least they owe some of their future picks. And so obviously in this scenario, they wouldn't be getting any of those back, which makes it difficult to be bad, which they certainly would be without Giannis. But it might just have to be kind of a sunk cost thing for Milwaukee where they just realize, okay, we're not going to get any of our picks back anyway, so we might as well just make the best deal we can. And that option still might be Houston. Pros and cons for Houston, you're adding Giannis. Like, that's an unbelievable group. Negatives, you're giving up significant pieces of your rotation, including guys like Jabari Smith that have been really good and is on a pretty fair contract over the next handful of seasons that he just signed. And as I mentioned before, the Rockets are already good. They know that they're really good right now. And adding Giannis, yes, makes them better, but does it make them better in the middle of the year when they've kind of built this identity already? And then you have to add such a giant piece like Giannis. But like I said, I think that's the first phone call that is made, is to Houston. I think the second phone call is to the San Antonio Spurs. And again, the trade on screen is just players that would likely need to be included in order to make the salaries work. The core piece here is Devin Vassell, and we know that San Antonio has a bunch of draft picks they can offer and add into this deal as well. You could also maybe try and figure out a way to get De'Aaron Fox involved in this deal, although I think he's become pretty essential for them because Dylan Harper's been good, but especially if you're adding Giannis, like, you're trying to win the title right now, you probably want to keep as much guard help as you can on a team that has two really good guards in those two guys, and then obviously Steph Castle. But maybe you could say Steph Castle is going to go out in this deal. Again, you can build out a lot from this structure. The deal could be Devin Vassell, Steph Castle, and all of the picks and all of the contracts, and the Spurs still might do that. The negatives for them is, are they truly ready to make this leap, especially if you're concerned about continued injury issues potentially for Victor Wembanyama, because this obviously massively speeds up the timeline in San Antonio. And whether the deal actually happens, if Giannis requests a trade, whether the deal actually happens in terms of him going to San Antonio, I think depends entirely on the Spurs' appetite and desire to trade a bunch of future pieces to speed up the timeline. And if they're not willing to do that, I don't think he's going to be a San Antonio Spur, as much as it would be cool to see him and Wemby together in the front court. I think those two teams are kind of in a tier of their own for a variety of reasons. One, they have a bunch of assets to actually make this work. Two, they're contenders that would actually be improved by adding Giannis. And three, most importantly, they're in the Western Conference. I don't think the Bucks would be super excited to trade away Giannis and have him come to Milwaukee a bunch every single regular season. So I think it is relatively important that the team be in the West. If that isn't the case, I think the next team on the list would be the New York Knicks. The reason I mention them is because we know that in the offseason there were at least some conversations had about the Knicks acquiring Giannis Antetokounmpo. And the two ways in which they could do that would be trading away Karl-Anthony Towns because his salary number works, or, as I show you on screen here, Mikal Bridges plus some other contracts plus some picks. Now, compared to the Houston and San Antonio options, this is not all that enticing. Again, you can do more stuff here if you'd like, but they don't have nearly as many draft picks. They don't even have all of their own picks, and they don't have like core foundational young players that the Bucks would be excited about the way the Rockets and Spurs do. However, if the Spurs and Rockets aren't inclined to add those players, maybe the Knicks could work themselves into this conversation. The big piece, of course, would be Mikal Bridges, who obviously has had a lot of trade value in the past. The problem is, does he actually have a lot of value to Milwaukee? Could they find a third team maybe for Mikal Bridges to go to, and then they get value elsewhere? I find it hard to believe they'd be super excited about adding Bridges in the first place, but this would be, I think, the more likely of the two structures where they have Jalen Brunson, OG Anunoby, Giannis, and then Karl-Anthony Towns as their kind of core four guys, and they're willing to trade away some of these perimeter wings like Mikal Bridges and Josh Hart in order to make this happen. Again, I think they're in a different tier than Houston and San Antonio are just in terms of the compensation they have available, but I do think they're interesting. Another team here that, again, if we're sticking in the Eastern Conference, is the Atlanta Hawks. Now, they could theoretically do something here where they are adding Giannis alongside of Trae Young. I think in all likelihood that would require them to trade away Jalen Johnson in the deal, and obviously Giannis is better than Jalen Johnson, but I think there would be at least some hesitation from Atlanta to include him because he's really, really good, and it couldn't just be him. You'd have to have some other contracts, some other assets involved as well. Keep in mind that Atlanta does have an extra pick in this upcoming draft. They have the Pelicans pick, which is potentially the most valuable draft asset on the board of all the teams we've talked about. So would Jalen Johnson, the Pelicans pick, and some other stuff, maybe even Zachary Ricochet, would that be enough for Milwaukee to not only be interested in sending him to Atlanta, but also be willing to trade him within the Eastern Conference? I also would mention that to this point, I'm not considering where Giannis would potentially want to go because I think he'd be relatively open to a lot of opportunities because his primary goal would be winning. I'm sure, of course, he'd like to go to some of these bigger markets, but primarily the goal would be to win. And so I think that adding him there in Atlanta alongside Trae Young with whatever else they have could at least be semi-interesting to him. A couple of other teams I want to mention just from like a wild card perspective here. First would be the Minnesota Timberwolves. They obviously have Rudy Gobert. They have Anthony Edwards. I'm sure most of you are thinking, oh, they're trading Julius Randle in this scenario. Yeah, they could do that, but I think more accurately, it's more likely that the Bucks would want Jaden McDaniels in the deal, not Julius Randle. And so would Minnesota be willing to, obviously you'd have this gigantic team, but in this scenario, you're also trading away Naz Reid because salary reasons and Rob Dillingham. And again, you can throw some picks in there as well if you'd like. Would that be enough to interest Milwaukee? Because I'm not sure that Minnesota would be willing to trade away McDaniels, but if they did, he'd be pretty high on the list in terms of assets potentially available in a Giannis trade. One of the other wildcard teams to mention here would be the Miami Heat. They always just seem to be involved in these kinds of conversations when it comes to superstars potentially being moved. I don't really see a lot of options for them. They do have some salaries to work, but one of them is Terry Rozier. I don't think I need to tell you why that's going to be complicated. Another would be Tyler Hero, who I just don't think the Bucks would be interested in as like the focal point of a deal. Obviously, you've got Khalil Ware, which is interesting. I don't think Miami quite sneaks its way into these conversations from a compensation standpoint. Now, if Giannis is really that desperate to go to Miami specifically, then maybe that would work out. But I think they're definitely more kind of in this wild card territory. And then the last like real wild card team I would mention would be Golden State. The reason they're a wild card is because it's very, very difficult for them to match salaries. The two big salaries that they have are Jonathan Kuminga, who can be traded here relatively soon, I think in January or February, And the other big contract would be Draymond Green. And obviously Draymond does not have value to Milwaukee, but if maybe they could find a third team to take him, they do have the salary to put together a team featuring Jimmy Butler, Steph Curry, and then of course Giannis. And Giannis would kind of bridge them into the next era of Warriors basketball, but they'd have to trade away a bunch of stuff in order to do so. To me right now, those are all of the teams. I think most likely, if they are willing to trade a bunch of stuff for Giannis, I think Houston and San Antonio are kind of in pole position here. And then after that is kind of that second tier headline by the Knicks. And then after that is all of these wild card teams that we could see it happening, but it would be kind of in the vein of when the Bucks ironically traded for someone like Damian Lillard, just kind of came out of nowhere and all of a sudden they were the team. The last point I would make here is if Giannis does not go to the team and request a trade, this is not happening. I don't think the Bucks are going to be proactive in trading away Giannis. And if he does request a trade, I don't think it's a guarantee that it actually happens because your options are just more limited in the middle of the season, as I mentioned, but also it's not like he's a free agent this offseason. The real pivot point in the Giannis situation was summer of 2026. They're going to offer him an extension. If he doesn't take it, that kind of clues them in on, okay, this guy's not staying long term. We don't want to lose him for nothing the following year. That's not the scenario right now. So I could see a situation where he goes to the team and says, hey, I'm thinking about leaving. They're like, okay, cool. We'll talk to you in the offseason. And then it might be awkward, but we've seen teams do that before. And the only other caveat I would bring up is it's important to understand just how good most of these teams are. Houston, San Antonio, they see themselves as contenders in their conference. The Knicks see themselves as contenders in their conference. You don't want to submarine your entire season because Tari Eason and Jabari Smith aren't sure if they're going to get traded for Giannis the next morning or not. So you don't want to be too involved publicly in these trade conversations, especially if you don't actually end up making the deal. But this is obviously a crazy, crazy headline and something that I can't wait to continue to talk about more. I certainly didn't expect to talk about it today.